Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our brief presentation and then talk a little bit about why we're here and answer questions. I think we have some folks that may want to come up. Thank you for coming to the public meeting today. It's appropriate that it's raining outside. I didn't order that, but it's just sometimes the rain keeps people away. But I think it's appropriate that it's raining while we're talking about floodplain changes. My name's Kevin Shunk, and I work for the City of Austin. I'm the city's floodplain administrator, and it was the group that I work with here at the city is the group that has been working on these engineering studies for floodplain changes. And we work for the Watershed Protection Department here at the City of Austin. And just a brief overview of what the Watershed Protection Department does is we protect the public from flood hazards. We try to improve water quality, water pollution issues in our creeks, and then protect the public from erosion hazards. So while initially, really, what we're talking about today is flood hazards. Some of the information that we've created are actually used by other parts of our department to help their missions as well. Everybody who has a name tag on in the back here is a staff member from the floodplain office or our public information office. They'll be either stationed around the tables or milling around. So if you have any questions about the maps you see, about the information that we have in the back, what you got in the mail, please ask us. That's why we're here. We're here to try to answer as many questions as we can. I'm going to run through a brief presentation to kind of go over some general points, talk a little bit about the floodplain studies, where we did floodplain studies, why we did floodplain studies, and how they will affect you, because they could affect you in some way. We'll do general questions in this big group here. If you have some site-specific questions, you could talk to somebody back here. Everybody should have a laptop, and they can kind of zoom into your area and really get a little more detailed about a question you may have. And then we'll talk a little bit when we have tables also set up to talk about flood safety, about development rules if your property is in the floodplain, and flood insurance, which is a very important topic as well. So the city initiated these current round of floodplain studies in about 2010. Now, the city is a member of the National Flood Insurance Program, and because we're part of the NFIP, then FEMA allows the citizens of Austin to purchase flood insurance through FEMA, federally backed flood insurance. If we weren't a member of the NFIP, you couldn't purchase flood insurance from FEMA, and it would be much, much more expensive than it is now. Not to mention, if there's a federally declared disaster, if you're not in the NFIP, you don't get any money. So they're important for a lot of reasons to be a member of the NFIP. But FEMA doesn't necessarily come down to the communities and say, you need to study these creeks. They leave it to the communities to say, you tell us what needs to be studied based upon the risks that you have in the city, based upon how old the floodplain studies are, and because we're obligated to the citizens to help you with flood risk and to tell you if there are flood risks in the community, because that's our job. It's one of the missions of the department. The goal of these studies, again, is to understand flood risk. We did not do these studies to promote flood insurance. We did not do these studies to make it harder to develop your property. Although those things may happen, our goal is to tell citizens what their flood risk is at their property. It's important for us to tell you what could happen so that you can be prepared and you can plan accordingly. Not to mention the results of these studies will be the other parts of our department will take these floodplain studies and we'll try to figure out city projects that we can do to alleviate some flooding. So capital improvement projects, maybe regional detention ponds. We've built some flood walls in the city. We've done some channel projects. Lots of things that we've done around town to try to mitigate some of the flooding that happens. So we'll have other parts of the department that will use that. And like I said, some of the folks in the erosion group can use our studies to try to do some erosion control projects. And a lot of the folks in the water pollution area, they'll use the studies as well. So while it's the floodplain group that's creating them, the whole department and a lot of the development community can use these models as well. I meant to bring a copy of my final map. You may have seen in the past a copy of what's called a flood insurance rate map. They call them Z-folds. It's a Z-fold map. You open it up. That will still be a product of this study, a floodplain map on paper. But people are kind of getting away from paper. So we'll have firms but I don't think that's going to be the best way to disseminate the information to everybody. What's great about the technology we have now is we have floodplain maps that are computerized and digital, and we can put them on a Google map, or we can put them on a viewer on the website. A lot easier for people to zoom and see where the floodplain is on their property. So the result of it all are floodplain maps. The total cost of these studies, current round of studies, is about $3 million. And about 3 years ago, FEMA came to us and said, do you have any studies that you would like to do? We have some grant money that you can use. And so we got a $1.1 million grant from FEMA. So the city's portion was around $2 million. I'm going to touch on kind of how you put together a floodplain study. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there are basically 4 parts to a floodplain study. There's survey information, and that can be us hiring a company to fly an airplane over and shoot laser points down and get to ground elevations for the entire city. And that information is very valuable for floodplain studies because we can't afford to send a survey crew out to every section of the creek and survey every bit. That would be way too expensive. So we use what's called LiDAR information for floodplain studies. However, we do send survey crews out and have done so for these new floodplain studies to take ground elevations. What's the elevation of the ground at all these points? And maybe they'll survey a bridge so we know what the bridge opening looks like. Maybe we'll know what the elevation of the top of the road is. And then at other places where there may not be a bridge, they'll survey a cross-section of the stream. So you may have seen survey crews out. That would have been, what, two years ago or so. Maybe you didn't see them, but they were out and about doing a lot of surveys around town. We did hire 2 engineering consultants to do these floodplain studies for us. So the engineering consultants actually did the work. City staff reviewed it as it came in to make sure that it met our standards and it was appropriate for use for the city. Okay, so there's survey information. Hydrology. Hydrology is a science. It is a science to try to figure out how much water falls from the ground and gets to the creek. That's what hydrology is telling us, is how long it takes to get to the creek and how much water will be in the creek when it gets there. Hydraulics is, once you know how much water is in the creek, hydraulics is a part of engineering that tells us how high the water is going to get into the creek. So again, those are 2 engineering models we use. We use hydraulic models, hydrologic models, and hydraulic models to tell us how high the water is going to get. Now, once we know how high the water is going to be, we need to represent it on a map. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying. The technology for mapping is really improved because we can do it digitally now. And you may have seen some of our websites that show changes in floodplains. You may have seen some of our websites that show the 100 or maybe the 25-year floodplain. Much better way for us to represent to the public where the flood risks are, so you can pan around, you can see your property, you can see maybe your parents' property, you can see your kids' property, wherever the case is, all that information is available right there. I'm going to go into a little bit of discussion about what it means when I say fully developed floodplain and what it means when I say FEMA floodplain, because they are different. In the city of Austin, we have 2 different floodplains. A fully developed floodplain means when we're doing the hydrologic piece, how much water, we consider the entire watershed to be fully developed. So that means if a lot has nothing on it, yet it's a commercial lot, we're going to consider that it's 60% impervious, for example. If an entire subdivision hasn't been built yet, but the lots are all there, we're going to consider every lot to be 45% impervious, all impervious cover. So that's what we say when we mean fully developed. It's a fully developed watershed. Obviously, that creates more water. And the city's regulations for development are all based on 100-year fully developed conditions. Now, a FEMA floodplain is something different. FEMA floodplains are based on the conditions that exist at the time of the study. So if the subdivision is platted and all the lots are there, but there's no houses, then the FEMA model, hydrologic model, there's 0 impervious cover. And the reason for that is FEMA can't require someone to buy flood insurance based upon a future condition that hasn't happened. So when all these maps that we have here and the maps that are on the Floodplain Changes website that was on some of the information you got, this is all FEMA floodplain information. When you're talking to folks in the back about development regulations, that's fully developed floodplains. So just understand that there are 2 different things. In some cases, they're the same take, for example, Shoal Creek. It's downtown. It's pretty much fully developed. It is fully developed. So the FEMA and the fully developed are the exact same thing. Okay, which creeks did we study and why did we study them? You've probably read articles in the paper, online, recently maybe, or even in the past, about FEMA floodplains. And people saying, well, FEMA came out with this new floodplain. It's so old, and they just placed it on top of this map, and it's not even on the center line of the creek because their data is so old. That's a problem of floodplain studies, and that's one of the reasons why the city looks back at the creeks that we have for us to decide what creeks we're going to study. We want information to be new because it makes it more relevant and it means more to folks. So that's one of the reasons why we study floodplains, is because the information behind them is old or outdated, and in some cases we may not have had any floodplain information there at all. These are the watersheds that we study, and I'm going to go over them in detail. You can see that's a watershed map. When you talk to somebody in the floodplain office or in watershed protection, we all think watersheds. And so when you say Bull Creek watershed, I know where that is. I understand that some people don't talk watershed, so we're going to go through. I'll show you some roads so you kind of know what we're talking about. Okay, first is the Boggy Creek study. This darker section here is Boggy Creek. That's just east of 35. MLK runs right through the middle of it. Airport Boulevard runs right down here. That's the Boggy Creek channel. Not a lot of changes with Boggy Creek. You're familiar with the Miller development, and there's actually, let's see, 2 ponds that are built on that property. The one that's kind of more on the northern side, that's right next to Airport Boulevard, they call it the Lake Park Pond. That pond drains into Boggy Creek. But the Boggy Creek study that we had before didn't account for that pond, and it does provide some benefits to flooding. So we took into account that pond and changed the Boggy model slightly and did some minor hydrology updates with Boggy Creek. Not a lot of changes, nonetheless there are some, so you'll want to pay attention to those. This is the Bowl and West Bowl watershed, again in this darker area here. This is in the northwest part of town. This is 360 here. 2222 runs right through West Bull Creek, Old Lampasas Trail up here. That's the Bull Creek watershed. Bull Creek and West Bull Creek has all new data, new survey, new hydrology, new hydraulics, new mapping. Why? Because the previous data was 25 years old. So the maps that we had printed 5 to 7 years ago for Bull, while it may have been on a new map, it was not based on new information. Now Bull Creek is all new information, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to study it. And we also added a few tributaries to Bull Creek that had not been previously studied. The Carson Creek watershed, this is just north of the airport. You can see the airport on the south side, right at 183 and 71. On the east side of 183 has some gravel mine areas. And we had a new survey for Carson. We had studied Carson not too long ago, but we didn't have, the topographic information was not good and needed to be updated, so we added some survey information for Carson. This is Cottonmouth Creek. This is South Austin, a little bit southeast actually. Here's 183 right here. This is Colton Bluff Springs Road. Cottonmouth Creek drains into Onion Creek, and this is a good example of a creek where there's not necessarily a lot of development in this watershed. However, we're anticipating development, and so this is a model that developers and staff can use as development continues down. If you ever heard of Pilot Knob, it's right down in this area. Again, data that was 25 years old, new survey, new hydraulics. The Dry Creek East study, this is Cottonmouth that we just looked at. This is Dry Creek East. The F1 site is right there. It flows into the Colorado River way downstream of Longhorn Dam. All new data, survey, hydraulics, hydrology, mapping, brand new. Now we actually completed this Dry Creek East floodplain study a couple years ago. We're just incorporating it into the maps right now, but we did add 2 tributaries that weren't studied that we needed to update some information. Fort Branch Creek, again right here is Boggy Creek. And then 2 over there, this is Fort Branch Creek right here. Again, MLK, almost to 183 right there. Runs from 290 all the way down to where it hits 183 again.
Where's Airport Boulevard in that?
Airport Boulevard is right here. Fort Branch, again, all new data. Why? Because the data was, in some cases, 20 years old. It needed to be updated. Shoal Creek starts north up at Mopac and 183, comes all the way through downtown, and outfalls into Lady Bird Lake. Shoal has been studied. We did a portion of the study about 5 to 7 years ago, but we needed new survey and new hydraulics that were, in cases, 20 years old. Again, Shoal, obviously this is one that's fully developed. A lot of development is already there. A lot of redevelopment happening, though, which is why we want new floodplain information to use with that development. Tannehill Branch watershed, right in between Boggy and Fort, right smack in the middle. Tannehill Branch is the Mueller development is within the Tannehill Branch watershed. And it flows into Boggy Creek as well. Again, Tannehill, all new data. 25-year-old data. Bits and pieces of it have been updated, but we wanted to do an overall improvement to that study. So that's what we created for Tannehill. Okay, just a brief discussion on timeline. Here we are now. Right at the moment, like I said, fully developed condition watersheds in floodplain maps. We're using those now to regulate development in the watershed. So when a developer comes in and wants to do a development on Shoal Creek, and they ask for the Shoal Creek fully developed floodplain model, they're getting the one that we just finished. And in cases, we've been using it actually for the past year. If a resident comes in and wants to either add on to their house or build a new house, on a creek that we've just studied, we're using this brand new information, and we're using it right now. The process that we're starting now is the process to create new FEMA maps. The engineering piece of that is done, and now we're going through the process that FEMA requires. It's a federally mandated process to create a new FEMA map. So the FEMA appeal and comment period is a point where we will produce what's called preliminary FEMA maps, and we'll distribute those to the community. We'll have them at libraries, we'll have them here, or we'll have them online for people to see them. And we'll also be sending another notice. You'll get another postcard in the mail probably from us saying the appeal comment period is coming up. The appeal comment period is the time when the public can submit appeals or comments about the new FEMA maps. Now, a comment may be, you spelled my street name wrong, or my street's not even on here. We get those a lot, and those are pretty easy to fix. An appeal, if somebody believes that the floodplain information is incorrect, then they could submit an appeal, but an appeal has to be accompanied with technical information to back up the appeal. You can't just say, the FEMA map is wrong, I want it changed. But if you hired an engineer and said, my engineer looked at the study, they've created some new information, and we think the floodplain looks like this, that's an appeal and that the City of Boston would look at for FEMA to determine whether we would change the maps. So the appeal comment period is coming up in the fall of 2014. It's a 90-day period. And again, we'll be in contact with you either through signing up the email from the website, or we'll be sending out postcards as well. We'll produce final FEMA maps after the appeal comment period. We incorporate the appeals and comments. Spring of 2015 is when those will be, the final maps will come out. And once the final maps come out, again, federally mandated timelines, and we're anticipating that the maps will be effective, the FEMA maps, mid to late 2015. And the reason why that's important is any flood insurance changes because of these studies will not become effective until the maps become effective. So let's just say, for example, you're not in the floodplain now, but the new FEMA floodplain places you in the floodplain. Well, your lender or FEMA or your insurance agent are not going to see these floodplains until they're effective in the fall of 2015. Likewise, if you're in the FEMA floodplain now and you have a flood insurance purchase requirement, you can't have that removed if you're actually being taken out of the floodplain until the maps become effective. So again, fully developed information we're using now at the City of Boston. FEMA information does not apply for flood insurance until the maps become effective, which we're anticipating about mid to late 2015. That time frame could change a little bit. We're working with FEMA to try to set how that's going to work. Okay, so how can you be affected by floodplain changes? We've talked about it a little bit. Again, the goal of our studies is to understand flood risk, and it's for public safety. It's so you as the homeowner, the business owner, developer can either develop something that's flood safe, or in most cases, you can keep you and your family safe by knowing the flood risk at your property. Now, maybe the house is shown in the floodplain, but we can help you to determine if it's only a foot deep. We can help you to determine if it's 6 feet deep, because that makes a huge difference. Knowing that information can help you to prepare in case of a flood. We have some resources for you to create disaster kits, all kinds of information you can find out. So in case it does start to rain, what are you going to do? And it's a good thing to talk about with you and your family, come up with a plan so you know what to do in case of a time of flood. I don't know if it's going to flood this weekend, but it's going to rain a little bit more. So flood safety and preparedness, we have a table back there. We can talk about some of the tools that the City of Austin uses, better ways for us to represent when roads are closed, for example, and in better ways for us to communicate with the public for flood hazards. A table to talk about flood insurance. There is the federal government passed a bill that mandates flood insurance changes. It's called Bigger Waters 2012, or BW 2012. And I guess all I will say now about that is flood insurance rates will change. Likely they'll go up. Lots of stories in the paper about the National Flood Insurance Program and that they can't pay for themselves. That's true. And one of the ways that they've figured out to fix that is to kind of base the rates on actuarial rates as opposed to subsidized rates. How bigger waters may affect you, it's a little unknown right now. Jameis and Courtney can help you out with what we know about it. But again, no flood insurance requirement changes until the maps become effective in mid to late 2015. And then development rules. Having a property in the floodplain, there are restrictions to developing in the floodplain. That includes building a new house, building an addition. In some cases, even remodeling could have an impact. So when you apply for a building permit here at the city and your house is in the floodplain, that application is routed to the floodplain office, and then we review it for compliance with the floodplain rules. We can talk to you about how those rules apply and what may or may not be restricted. I won't go into a lot about the flood safety and preparedness, a lot of links here, and Matt Porcher has some of that information, and we've got a nice resource page for you. But essentially our message to you is to learn, plan, live. Learn about flood risks, plan for it, and then you can live through it and live with it because it's something that exists. Talked a little bit about flood insurance, just real quick on some things. Typically, homeowners insurance policies don't cover flood damages at all. And sometimes people don't realize that until after it happens, and then there's no money there to help them through those flood damages. The average flood insurance claim in the city is almost $16,000. We've got about 5,500 flood insurance policies in the city, and we have about around 12,000 buildings and properties in the floodplain. So maybe some people that should be insured, we'll see. Please consider flood insurance even if you're not in the floodplain, because if you're near it, you still have some flood risk. I talked a little bit about regulation and development. We can talk a little bit about that. I was going to do my demo. I'm not exactly set up for that. How about we've got folks in the back with laptops that can go through the website, the Floodplain Changes website, where you see all of this information, and they'll show you how to, you get your address. You essentially go to the website, type in the address, it zooms into the address that you typed, and then the purple is the area that is currently in the floodplain and will remain in the floodplain. Now, the elevation may go up or down, depends on the situation. The green is the area that's no longer in the floodplain, and the red is an area that's now included in the floodplain. So I think this is a nice way for us to represent the changes that are happening, and that's really one of the key things that people ask us about. Okay, that's me. If you have any questions, you can call me. The general floodplain office number is another good way to get a hold of a variety of people, and there's the contact information.